In this lecture, we will cover the CFA Level 2 reading on credit default swaps. Here are the sections in this reading. There is an introductory section followed by a section which talks about the basic definitions and the concept of a credit default swap, and then the basics of valuation and pricing. Note that we are not going to get into details here, and this material will be covered at a high level. And then finally, we will talk about the applications of credit default swaps. Let's start with an introduction. Over the last few readings, we have spent a fair amount of time talking about interest rate risk and how to manage this risk. We haven't really said much about managing credit risk, and that is where this particular reading comes in. Our focus here will be on how to manage credit risk using credit default swaps. But before we get into credit default swaps, let's just understand that there are several kinds of credit derivatives. And here is a definition of a credit derivative. A credit derivative is a derivative instrument in which the underlying is a measure of a borrower's credit quality. Broadly speaking, there are four types of credit derivatives, but the one that is most popular and the one that we will focus on in this reading is credit default swaps, generally referred to as CDS. Here is the definition of a credit default swap. A credit default swap is a derivative contract between two parties, a credit protection buyer and a credit protection seller, in which the buyer makes a series of cash payments to the seller and receives a promise of compensation for credit losses resulting from the default. That is, a predefined credit event of a third party. This picture will illustrate the point. We have two parties, a protection buyer and a protection seller. Let us say that the underlying here is a bond, and for simplicity we'll say that the protection buyer has invested in this bond and therefore faces credit risk. And again, for simplicity, we'll assume that a credit event is one where there is a default on payments associated with this bond. If you think about it, what the protection buyer is doing is getting insurance. So the protection buyer pays a certain premium to the protection seller, and these premium payments are made periodically if no default occurs. If this is a 5-year contract, then over a 5-year period, the premium payments will be made. If there is a default, then the premium payments will stop. This segment at the bottom, the dashed line, is called the protection leg. If there is a credit event, in other words, there is some sort of a default and the value of the bond goes down, then the CDS can be exercised and the protection seller will need to make a payment. This payment is therefore also called a contingent payment because it is contingent on the credit event happening. And that is emphasized over here. The payment happens if the default occurs. That was a high-level explanation. In section 2, there are several subsections. We'll talk about the different types of credit default swaps, features of the CDS market. We'll talk about credit and succession events. Here I briefly alluded to a credit event, but we'll get into more detail. Then the settlement protocols. So how do we settle over here? In case there is a default, what is the settlement process? We'll talk about CDS index products, and finally market characteristics. Let's start with the different types of credit default swaps. There are three types. The first one is a single name CDS. And a single name CDS is associated with one specific borrower. If we go back to the picture from the previous slide, we have a protection buyer and a protection seller. The protection buyer makes premium payments and the protection seller will make a contingent payment if there is a credit event. Now, underneath this, we only have one particular buyer. Underneath this, we have only one specific borrower. The borrower is called the reference entity. Now, the borrower might have issued a corporate bond. So this borrower might be General Electric. General Electric might have issued a particular bond, and if the CDS is on that bond, then the bond is called the reference obligation. It is the debt instrument which has been issued by the borrower. Also note that the CDS would cover any debt obligation which is pari passu, and this is a term that we see in fixed income securities. Pari passu means at the same level. More specifically, it means bonds which are ranked equally in priority of claims. So if the borrower is General Electric and General Electric has issued several bonds, then the bonds that rank at the same level in terms of priority of payments are pari passu. The CDS would cover those bonds which are ranked at the same level plus bonds that are ranked higher. So this is an important point to note. The next type is an index CDS. An index CDS allows participants to take positions on the credit risk of a combination of companies. Now, in this case, again, there will be a protection buyer, a protection seller, but underneath, we won't just have one borrower, we are going to have several borrowers, a combination of companies, and therefore the protection buyer is buying protection. So in this case, the protection buyer is taking a position on the credit risk of a combination of companies. You can think of this as some sort of a portfolio. An important concept here is that of credit correlation. This refers to the correlation of the credit risk across the different companies in the index. The more correlated the defaults, so if the risk of default for these various companies in the index is relatively high, then it will be more costly for the protection buyer to purchase protection. In other words, the protection buyer will need to make relatively higher premium payments to the protection seller in order to get the protection. And hopefully this makes sense. If the correlation is high, then that means that if one or two of these companies start defaulting, then the probability of the other companies defaulting is quite high. So the amount of compensation that the protection seller would then have to pay would be very high. The risk would be high, and therefore the premium that needs to be paid by the protection buyer would be high. The third type of a CDS is called a tranche CDS, and the curriculum points out that we don't really need to study this, but very simplistically you can imagine that a tranche means a slice. So just like we talked about tranches in fixed income, there would be some concept of slicing payments with a CDS, but this is not within the scope of our particular reading, so don't worry about this. Now, you do need to worry about the examples because this particular reading does not have practice problems. It has several good examples, and I'm quite sure that if you get a question on the exam, it will in some way be related to the examples that you see in this reading. Here in this example, we'll talk about the concept of cheapest to deliver. Assume that a company with several debt issues trading in the market files for bankruptcy, and this is an example of a credit event. What is the cheapest to deliver obligation for a senior CDS contract. Now, before we go into the response, let us just understand this cheapest to deliver concept. As we've said several times, there is a protection buyer and a protection seller. If there is a credit event, then the protection seller needs to compensate the protection buyer. And if the protection seller has the option to give one of several bonds to the protection buyer, then obviously the protection seller is going to give the cheapest bond or the cheapest option. On the previous slide, we talked about the concept that the bond that can be delivered would be either at the same level, pari passu, or better. Now, if we are talking here about a senior CDS contract, then clearly a subordinated unsecured bond would be below or would be low in ranking. So this would not be an option. We are then left with B and C, a senior unsecured bond trading at 50% of par and a 2-year senior unsecured bond trading at 45% of par. Between these two, the protection seller is going to deliver the cheaper one, and clearly the bond which is trading at 45% of par is cheaper. So this is the one that will be delivered. For completeness, I would also want you to read this solution from the curriculum. Next, we come to the important features of CDS markets and instruments. The CDS market is large, global, and well organized. The unofficial industry governing body is called the International Swaps and Derivatives Association, or ISDA. This organization publishes industry-supported conventions that facilitate the function of the market. They have published this standard master agreement, and very often when parties engage in a transaction, they will use this master agreement. And as you might imagine, this can save a lot of legal costs. Whenever two parties engage in a credit default swap, clearly there needs to be a notional amount which has to be specified and a maturity date. A typical maturity date is 5 years from when the contract is signed. This is an important concept that we'll talk about here and then in more detail later. The concept of a CDS spread. If we have a protection buyer and a protection seller, and we have some underlying reference entity, clearly the protection buyer is making some payment related to the risk associated with this underlying entity. What we can say right now is that the CDS spread is associated with the credit risk of this underlying entity. The way the market works, the protection buyer will pay a standard rate, which is either 1% or 5% to the protection seller. Let us say that this underlying entity is an investment grade bond, in which case the standard payment would be 1%. But this 1% might not be enough to cover the credit risk associated with the underlying instrument. If that is the case, then there will be some upfront payment or premium to compensate for the difference between this 1% rate and the credit risk associated with the underlying instrument. When we talk about the valuation of credit default swaps later, we'll get into more detail on this subject. Now let's talk about credit and succession events. A credit event is what defines default by the reference entity. You can think of this as the triggering event which will cause the protection seller to make this contingent payment to the protection buyer. There are three general types of credit events, And clearly these credit events have to be defined so that there is as little ambiguity as possible about a credit event. If these credit events are not clearly defined, then there can be a legal battle between these two entities. But here are the three general types: bankruptcy, failure to pay, and restructuring. Bankruptcy is straightforward. If the reference entity files for bankruptcy, that would typically be classified as a credit event. Another classic credit event is a failure to pay. If this reference entity, which is the borrower, does not make a scheduled payment or falls short on making the scheduled payment, then that would classify as a failure to pay. Restructuring can take on several different forms, and I'll quote here from the curriculum. Restructuring refers to a number of possible events, including reduction or deferral of principal or interest, change in seniority or priority of an obligation, or change in the currency in which principal or interest is scheduled to be paid. And then here comes the most important point. To qualify as a credit event, the restructuring must be involuntary, meaning that it is forced on the borrower. So that is key. For restructuring to be considered a credit event, it needs to be involuntary. Next, we come to the discussion of succession events. Succession events can arise when changes occur in corporate structure like mergers, spin-offs, and divestitures. The point here is that if an event like this occurs, then who is liable to make payments? And the answer is that within the ISDA, which we talked about before, there is a committee called the Determinations Committee. And if there is any doubt, then the Determinations Committee figures out who is liable to make the CDS related payments. Settlement protocols. If a credit event does occur, then the two parties to the CDS have the right to settle. There are two ways of settling. Either we can have a physical settlement or a cash settlement. With a physical settlement, the protection seller needs to deliver the underlying instrument. With a cash settlement, we determine the loss of the protection buyer, and then the protection seller compensates the protection buyer for that loss. Cash settlement is much more common than physical settlement. Now keep in mind that if there is a credit event, let's say there is a default which is a failure to pay, this does not mean that the creditor will lose the entire amount owed. We need to understand the concept of a recovery rate and a payout ratio. Let's say that we have a recovery rate of 40%. This means that for every 100 that is owed, 40 is going to be recovered. Then in the context of the credit default swap, the payment which needs to be made is 60%, not the entire 100%. Note that what is happening here is that the protection buyer is being compensated for the credit loss, the amount that the protection seller will not receive. So let's make this more concrete. The payout ratio is 1 minus the recovery rate. Again, this payout ratio is what the protection seller will pay. So the payout is from the context of the protection seller, and obviously that is the amount that the protection buyer will receive. This is 1 minus the recovery rate, and therefore the payout amount is simply the ratio multiplied by the notional amount. Let's look at this example which deals with settlement preferences, and it is quite important. A French company files for bankruptcy. which triggers various CDS contracts. So this company is the reference entity. It has two series of senior bonds outstanding. A, which trades at 30% of par, and B, which trades at 40% of par. Investor X owes 10 million of A and owns 10 million of CDS protection. So X is a protection buyer, and Y owns 10 million of bond B and owns 10 million of CDS protection. So both X and Y are protection buyers. Determine the recovery rate for both CDS contracts. Now this illustrates the point of cheapest to deliver. The two bonds are trading at different prices. From a delivery perspective, since A is trading at 30% of par, the implication is that 30% will be recovered. Also note that A will be the cheaper to deliver. Between the two, A is cheaper to deliver. So this is the bond that we are concerned with. The recovery rate then for both is going to be 30%. Next part, explain whether investor X would prefer to cash settle or physically settle her CDS contract, or whether she is indifferent. The answer is that she would be indifferent, because if she cash settles, she would get 7 million, which is 1 minus the recovery rate multiplied by 10 million, plus the bond would be worth 3 million. Note that she does own the bond, which is now at 30% of par. The alternative is that she can physically deliver her bond for 10 million. So in both cases, she will receive 10 million. What about investor Y? Investor Y would prefer a cash settlement, because with the cash settlement, he will receive 7 million and his bond is worth 40% or 10 million or 4 million, which adds up to 11 million. With a physical settlement, he would deliver the bond and get 10 million, which is less than 11. So clearly, he would prefer a cash settlement. And for completeness, I would encourage you to read the solution from the curriculum. CDS index products. A company called Market has been instrumental in producing CDS indices. As with equity indices, the CDS indices are not in of themselves tradable, but the industry has created funds which track the indices that have been defined and produced by Market. Indices are classified by regions and then further classified by credit quality. Indices in North America are referred to as CDX indices, and indices in Europe, Asia, and Australia are referred to as iTraxx. In North America, indices which are based on investment grade bonds or investment grade credit are referred to as CDX IG, and indices based on high yield bonds or junk bonds are called CDX HY. Main refers to investment grade and crossover refers to high yield. Let's take the CDX IG index. This consists of 125 investment grade North American companies, and unless you are told otherwise, assume that these are equally weighted. So if an investor buys protection with 250 million worth of notional principal, then the protection associated with each company is 2 million, which would be 250 divided by 125. Index CDS have become quite popular. They are typically more liquid and therefore have a higher trading volume than single name CDS. Let us now look at example 3, which is important: hedging exposure using CDS. Assume an investor sells 500 million of protection on CDX IX index, and remember this has 125 companies. But this investor is concerned about the credit worthiness of a few of the components. So the investor hedges a portion of the credit risk in each. For company A, he purchases 3 million of single named CDS protection. So notice that here protection is being purchased and therefore this is hedging. Company A subsequently defaults. What is the investor's net exposure to A? Based on this position where the investor sells protection, the amount associated with company A would be 500 over 425, which is 4 million. So this is 4 million of protection which has been sold. And then here we have 3 million of protection which is purchased. So the net exposure is 1 million. What portion of his exposure to company A has he hedged? That answer is 75% because he has hedged 3 million out of 4 million. What is the remaining notional on his index CDS trade? If company A defaults and company A was worth 4 million, then the remaining notional would be 500 minus 4 million, which is 496 million. I would want you to read the solution, and there is something that I'll highlight here. Notice this use of long and short. When an investor buys protection, then that position is called short, because when an investor buys protection, he benefits if the reference entity defaults. So short is a position which benefits when there is a problem with the underlying. The opposite position where the investor is selling protection is called long, because here the benefit happens if the reference entity does well. Section 2.6 deals with market characteristics. This section is not explicitly mentioned in the learning objectives, so I'll simply highlight the most important points. Transactions are executed in the over-the-counter market by phone, instant message, and Bloomberg message service. Trade information is reported to the Depository Trust and Clearinghouse Corporation, which is a US headquartered entity providing post-trade clearing, settlement, and information services for many kinds of securities, in addition to asset custody and asset servicing. So even though this is considered an OTC market, but there are some aspects of an exchange. In fact, new regulations require that almost all CDS be centrally cleared, meaning that the parties will send their contracts through clearing houses that collect and distribute payments and impose margin requirements, as well as mark positions to the market. In so doing, a considerable amount of systematic risk is eliminated. So the larger point here is that in the past, the CDS market was not particularly regulated. And when we had the credit crisis of 2007-2008, while there were multiple causes, but many blamed the CDS market for the crash. We can say that CDS played a part in the crash, and subsequent to this, there was substantially more regulation that was introduced to the CDS market. And what we are seeing over here is an impact of that regulation. So bottom line is that the CDS market is much more regulated now than it was in the past.